Hey everyone and welcome back to Diving Squid. This is the second episode in my online multiplayer tutorial series. In the last episode we looked at creating a username panel and then we also designed the main menu. If you haven't seen the last episode, make sure you check that out and then come back to this one. In this episode we'll look at adding player movement to our game and actually creating the main game. So I'm going to open the Unity scene, and on the menu controller we made last tutorial, I'm going to open our menu controller script. I'm going to start by giving our user the ability to actually create and join games. So I'm going to create a public create game function, and inside this I'm going to set photonnetwork.createRoom, and inside the parentheses create game input.text, which is our input field, and then new room options, and set the max players. I'm going to set mine to around 5. You could set yours to 4 or 3 or whatever photon plan you're on. Next I'm going to create our join game function, and this is so that our player can join a game that already exists, but if our player ends up typing in a game that doesn't exist, it'll automatically create a new game with that name for him. I'm going to also set my max players equal to 5, and then photonnetwork.join or create room, and then inside this join game input.text. This is what's going to let our player create a room that's not already created. I'm going to head back to Unity, and then on our join and create buttons I'm going to add an on-click event and drag in my menu controller. On the join button I'm going to add the join game function, and on our create button I'm going to add the create game button. Then I'm going to rename this scene to main menu. Next I'm going to create a new scene, and this is going to be for our actual game. So I'm going to call this main game, and then I'm going to open it up. I'm going to change the background color just now so that we can test that it actually joins the scene. And then back in our menu controller script I'm going to create a private function called onJoinedRoom, which is a built-in photon function, so make sure you type the name right. And inside this I'm going to use photonnetwork.loadLevel and then type in the name of your game scene. In the build settings in our Unity I'm going to drag in my main game and main menu and then order them so that the menu comes first, and this will allow for changing between the scenes. If you hit play to test it, I'm going to type in a username and then create a test game, and if we hit create game you'll see that it takes us to our game scene. If we do the same on the join, even though we've not created a game called test, it automatically creates one for us. Inside our game scene I'm going to start by creating a new UI button, and then I'm going to drag the event system that gets made with the canvas underneath the canvas. Next, in our button I'm going to change the UI and layout of it, and then I'm going to reset its transform so it sits in the center of the screen. This is going to be what starts the game and spawns our player into the world. So type something like start, and make sure you set the canvas to scale with screen size, and then I'm going to create a new UI image, and I'm going to scale this to the entire width of the screen so that it creates a nice panel over our game, and I'm going to lower the opacity a bit and reorder them in the hierarchy. I'm going to disable the canvas so that we can enable it through script and start building our game. I've imported my sprites that I've created, and I've got some ground sprites and my player idle animation and run animation. I can put up a 2D pixel art tutorial if you'd like, so comment below. Drag your ground sprite into the scene and then scale it up a bit and add a box collider to it. I'm going to edit the collider so that it fits the sprite, and then I'm going to duplicate it so that it goes off the screen so that our player has somewhere to walk. Then I'm going to create an empty game object, and I'm just going to call it ground and drag all my ground objects into this. Next I'm going to create a new 2D sprite which is going to be our player, so I'm going to drag my player art into this, and then I'm going to rename the sprite player. I'm also going to add a 2D rigid body component set to dynamic and a 2D box collider component. Make sure you adjust the box collider to fit your sprite. Also, so that our player doesn't end up rolling around, I'm going to freeze the rotation on the Z-axis. Now I'm going to add a new camera, and it's going to be a child of the player, so I'm going to call it player camera. We need this so that every separate player in our game has their own view of the world. I'm going to copy all the components from the main camera and paste the values into my new player camera. And then I'm going to disable the player camera because we're going to enable it through script. So on our player game object I'm going to add a new script called player, and this is where we're going to start to code our camera and our player controls. Open it up inside of Visual Studio, and first of all set mono behavior to photon.monoBehavior, and then I'm going to start typing. I'm going to create a public rigid body 2D called RB, a public animator called anim, and a public game object called player camera. Inside a private awake function, I'm going to set if photon view is mine, so that it only applies to our local player, not everyone in the game. And then inside this, I'm going to set our player camera to active. Next, I'm going to create a private function called checkInput so that we can start coding our player's movement. I'm going to need to create a few more variables for this. So firstly, I'm going to create a public photon view called photon view so that it only applies to our local player. And then I'm going to get a public sprite renderer called SR, and then a public text called player name text, which will eventually be our player's gamer tag, which will be in the next tutorial. And for this we're going to have to type using unityengine.ui at the top. And then I'm going to create a private update function, and inside this we're going to call our checkInput function if the photon view is ours, so that we can get our player moving. To actually code the movement, we're going to need to create a few more variables, such as a public bool called isGrounded for when we want to add jump, and I'm going to initially set this to false, and then a public float called move speed, and then a public float called jump force. In this episode we're just going to get our player moving left and right, and in the next episode we'll cover jumping. A link in the description will be there if you want to check out my 2D platformer controller tutorial. Now inside our checkInput function I'm going to set a variable move equal to a new vector 3, and then in the parentheses input.getAxis raw horizontal. I'm going to set our transform.position equal to move multiplied by move speed multiplied by time.delta time. Next, we're going to want to flip our sprite if he's facing one way or another. So I'm going to use input.getKeyDown, keycode A, and then we're going to set spriteRenderer.flipX equal to true. Copy and paste this, but change it to keycode D, and then set spriteRenderer.flipX to false. Back in Unity, I'm going to add a photon view script to our player and drag this into the photon view area on the player script component. I'm going to drag in my rigid body 2D and my sprite renderer, and then I'm going to give my move speed and my jump force a value of something like 5 and 70, which can always be adjusted later if I'm not happy with it. Next I'm going to add animation. I'm not going to go too in depth in this video because I've got a separate tutorial on that, which the link will also be in the description for. So I'm going to drag in my idle sprites, and then I'm going to create a new animation called run and drag in my run sprites. If you'd like more details on this, again, check the link in the description. Back to our player, I'm going to drag in my animator component into the anim section on the player script. I'm also going to turn my player into a prefab so we can spawn him later. And then I'm going to create an empty game object, and I'm going to call this game manager, as this is going to manage most of the things in our game scene. I'm going to add a new game manager script to this, and then I'm going to open it up inside of Visual Studio. To start with, we're going to set using unityengine.ui because that's what we'll be referencing in this script. And then I'm going to create a public game object called player prefab, and then another public game object called game canvas, which will be our main game canvas, and then lastly a public game object called scene camera, so we can disable and enable our camera. I'm going to start by creating a public function called spawn player, and inside this I'm going to get a random value so that our players all don't spawn in the exact same position. You can change the range to be as big or as small as you want. I'm going to keep mine quite small. And then I'm going to use photonnetwork.instantiate player prefab.name, and then new vector2, and then this.transform.position x multiplied by random value, and then this.transform position y, so that our player prefab is actually spawned into the scene, because we're going to delete him from the scene in a minute. And then lastly you want to finish off with quaternion.identity and then 0. Now inside a private awake function I'm going to set game canvas equal to true because we want it to be active at the start of our game, but once we've pressed the spawn player button we're going to set our game canvas to false and then our scene camera to false as well, so that neither are active. Back in Unity I'm going to delete the player from the scene, and then on our game manager I'll drag our player prefab into the player prefab section and the game canvas and scene canvas into the correct sections as well. Now on our button under our canvas I'm going to add a new onClick event and drag our game manager into it, and then select the spawn player function. This is going to get our player spawning when we click the button. Make sure to drag the player prefab into the resources folder, and then go back to the main menu and save it up and hit play, and you'll see if we enter a username and create a new game and hit start, our player is actually spawned and we can move left and right. To test that the multiplayer actually works, we can build a copy of the game and then play one version from our scene view and one version from the built view. So if I just enter Diving Squid as my first player and hit start, you'll see that I'm in the game as this player. And if I also hit start on the scene view in Unity and I enter the same test game, you'll see that our two players are in, although the characters aren't syncing movement. This is what we're going to work on in the next episode alongside a lot of other things, so make sure you stay tuned for that. It will be out this Saturday. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next tutorial. Thank you for all your support so far. If you'd like to support me further, then a link to my Patreon is in my description below. Thanks and bye.